Dr. James stared at his overdue bills scattered across the kitchen table. After being forced to close his small medical practice due to rising costs, he could barely afford his mortgage payments. That afternoon at the park, while walking to a job interview, he spotted an elderly man collapse on the path. Without hesitation, James missed his interview to help the injured stranger, using his last bandages from his medical bag to treat the man's wounds. As the sun set, James returned home, knowing he had lost his chance at financial stability. But at dawn the next morning, the steady beat of helicopter blades broke the silence above his modest house. The mysterious aircraft carried someone who had witnessed everything at the park, someone whose arrival would transform James's life in ways he never imagined. Hi everyone, welcome to Mystic Tales. Today, I'm excited to share a new story with you. James sat at his kitchen table that morning, sorting through a stack of unpaid bills. His hands trembled as he opened another letter from the bank. The mortgage payment was due in 3 days. Just need to make it through this interview, he whispered to himself, straightening his only clean tie. 6 months ago, his small medical practice had closed after rent doubled in the building. His savings were nearly depleted. The walk to the bus stop felt longer than usual. James checked his watch. He had left early to ensure he would arrive at the hospital interview on time. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves covered the park path. A sudden cry caught his attention. About 50 feet ahead, an elderly man was on the ground, clutching his leg. James quickened his pace and knelt beside him. "Try not to move, sir. I'm a doctor. Can you tell me where it hurts?" James asked, gently examining the man's leg. The elderly man grimaced. "My knee gave out. I slipped on these wet leaves. I'm Robert." James noticed a deep gash on Robert's knee, bleeding through his torn pants. He opened his medical bag, something he still carried out of habit. Inside was his last set of sterile bandages. "This will sting a bit, Robert," James said, cleaning the wound carefully. "The cut needs stitches. I can help you get to the emergency room." Robert shook his head. "No hospitals, please. I hate those places." James looked at his watch again. The interview was in 20 minutes. He thought about the bills on his table, the final notice from the bank. Then he looked at Robert's pale face. "Let me at least properly dress this wound. I have the supplies here," James said, knowing he would miss the interview. James spent the next 40 minutes carefully cleaning and bandaging Robert's knee. He helped the elderly man to a nearby bench and gave him water from his own bottle. "You didn't have to do all this," Robert said softly. "You've been so kind. Please, let me pay you something." James shook his head. "No payment needed. Just be careful walking on wet leaves from now on." As James walked home that evening, his phone showed 3 missed calls from the hospital's HR department. He had missed his chance at the job. The weight of his decision felt heavy, but he knew he had done the right thing. A black car drove slowly past him. Through the tinted windows, James couldn't see who was watching him make his way home in the gathering dusk. The next morning, James woke to the sound of helicopter blades. He pulled back his curtains to see a sleek black helicopter hovering near his neighborhood. Several of his neighbors stood in their yards, pointing up at the unusual sight. His phone rang. An unfamiliar number lit up the screen. "Hello, is this Dr. James?" a professional female voice asked. "Yes, speaking," James replied. "This is Sarah from Memorial Heights Hospital. I'm calling on behalf of our chief of medicine. Could you come in for a meeting this morning?" James ran his hand through his hair. "I apologize for missing yesterday's interview. I had an emergency. This isn't about yesterday's position. Mr. Thompson, our hospital director, would like to discuss a different opportunity. A car is already on its way to pick you up." James looked out his window again. A black car, similar to the one from yesterday, pulled up to his driveway. The drive to Memorial Heights took 30 minutes. Sarah, a tall woman in a gray suit, met him in the lobby. She led him to a large office on the top floor. "Dr. James, thank you for coming." A man in his 70s stood up from behind the desk. "I'm Robert Thompson." James stopped in his tracks. It was the elderly man from the park. "Please, Sit down, Robert gestured to a chair. I believe we met under different circumstances yesterday. You're the hospital director, James asked. Robert nodded. I was taking my morning walk when I fell. I wanted to see how our local doctors would treat an ordinary elderly patient. Most people walked past. But you stopped. You missed your interview to help me. I didn't know who you were, James said quietly. That's exactly the point, Robert smiled. You showed genuine care without knowing my position. That's the kind of doctor we need running our new community clinic. James sat straighter. Community clinic? We're opening a clinic in your old neighborhood. The area needs good doctors who care about people, not just profits. I'd like you to run it. Full funding, reasonable rent, and complete medical supplies. What do you say? James felt his throat tighten. He thought about his closed practice, his patients who couldn't afford to follow him to more expensive clinics. I would be honored, James managed to say. But why the helicopter? Robert chuckled. My usual transportation. I was observing the neighborhood to find the perfect location for the clinic. Your old medical building, as it turns out, is ideal. Over the next few days, James toured his old medical building with Robert. The space had been vacant since James had to close his practice. Paint peeled from the walls, and dust covered the empty reception desk. We'll renovate everything, Robert said, making notes on his tablet. New equipment, fresh paint, modern facilities, but we'll keep it welcoming for the community. James ran his hand along the familiar walls. My patients used to say this place felt like home. That's exactly what we want to maintain, Robert replied. Tell me what your old practice needed most. What made you have to close? James walked to the window, looking out at the neighborhood he knew so well. The rent increases hurt, but it was more than that. Many families here can't afford basic health care. I tried to help everyone I could, but the cost of supplies, staff, and equipment kept rising. Robert nodded. The new clinic will have a sliding payment scale. No one will be turned away because they can't pay. The hospital will cover operational costs. What about the staff? James asked. My old nurse Maria, she was amazing with patients. She's working at a pharmacy now. Call her. Robert handed James a phone. Offer her the position. We'll match her current salary and add benefits. James dialed Maria's number, his hand slightly shaking. When she answered, he could hear the smile in her voice. Dr. James, is it really you? Maria, how would you feel about coming back? The clinic is reopening, better than before. Maria's voice cracked with emotion. When do we start? Over the next hour, James and Robert walked through each room. They discussed adding a children's play area in the waiting room, a small laboratory for basic tests, and updated exam rooms. The renovations will take about 6 weeks, Robert explained. Use this time to contact your former patients. Let them know their doctor is coming back. James stopped at his old office door. The faded letters of his name were still visible on the glass. Why did you really choose me, Robert? There are many qualified doctors. Robert placed a hand on James's shoulder. Because you showed me that kindness, and medical care go hand in hand. You didn't just treat my injury in the park. You showed genuine concern. That's what this community needs. James looked at the empty rooms, already seeing them filled with patients again. For the first time in months, his future held more than just unpaid bills and missed opportunities. When can I start calling patients? James asked. Robert smiled. Right now. The phone lines are already being connected. 6 weeks passed quickly. James stood outside the renovated clinic on opening day. The morning sun reflected off the clean windows, and a new sign read, Community Family Care Center. Inside, Maria arranged supplies in the freshly painted reception area. Our first patient arrives in 10 minutes, Maria said, checking the computer. You remember Mrs. Garcia and her daughter Sophie? James smiled. Sophie must be 8 now. She always brought me drawings. The door chimed as Mrs. Garcia entered, holding Sophie's hand. The little girl's eyes widened at the bright, welcoming space. "Dr. James, we missed you so much," Mrs. Garcia said, tears in her eyes. "When you called about reopening, I couldn't believe it." Sophie tugged at James's coat. "I made you a new drawing, doctor. It's our family at your clinic." James knelt down to look at the crayon picture. "This is beautiful, Sophie. May I hang it in the waiting room?" The morning filled with familiar faces. James treated Mr. Peterson's arthritis, checked on the Torres twins' asthma, and gave Mrs. Lee her diabetes consultation. Each patient shared stories of the months without proper medical care. During lunch, Robert stopped by to check on the clinic's first day. He found James updating patient files at his desk. "How's everything going?" Robert asked. James looked up from his computer. "We've seen 15 patients already. 3 couldn't afford their medications, so the sliding scale program made a real difference." "That's exactly what we wanted," Robert said. "By the way, the hospital board reviewed your proposal for the weekend clinic hours." James straightened in his chair. Last week he had suggested opening on Saturday mornings for working families who couldn't visit during weekdays. "Robert approved it," Robert continued, "along with funding for a part-time pediatric nurse." Maria knocked on the office door. "Dr. James, your next patient is ready. It's Mr. Wilson with his blood pressure check." As James stood to leave, Robert touched his arm. "One more thing. Remember that park where we met? The hospital is setting up monthly free health screenings there. Would you coordinate them?" James paused at the door. "Monthly screenings would help so many people. We could catch health issues early, provide preventive care." "That's what I thought you'd say," Robert smiled. "The first screening is next month. Maria already started creating sign-up sheets." James walked to exam room 3, where Mr. Wilson waited. Through the window, he could see people in the waiting room, chatting with Maria, filling out forms. His clinic was alive again, but this time, it was stronger, more accessible, ready to help everyone who walked through its doors. 1 year later, James stood in the same park where he had helped Robert. Volunteers set up tables for the 12th monthly health screening event. Maria coordinated nursing students from the local college, showing them how to organize the blood pressure station. "The last screening helped detect early diabetes in 5 patients," Maria said, checking her clipboard. "They're all receiving treatment at the clinic now." James watched as families began arriving. Some he recognized as regular patients, others were new faces. A young mother approached him, carrying a sleeping toddler. "Dr. James, my neighbor told me about the free screenings," she said softly. "I haven't taken Tommy to a doctor since he was born. I couldn't afford it." "Let's take a look at Tommy right now," James smiled, leading them to the pediatric station. Robert arrived mid-morning, walking without the limp that had troubled him a year ago. He carried a folder under his arm. "James, do you have a moment?" Robert asked, gesturing to a nearby bench, the same bench where James had treated his injury. They sat down, watching the busy screening event. Robert opened his folder. "The hospital board reviewed the clinic's first-year numbers yesterday," Robert said. "Over 2,000 patients served, 400 children vaccinated, 800 chronic conditions managed. But the most impressive statistic? 0 patients turned away due to inability to pay." James thought about Tommy and his mother. "Every person deserves care, Robert. You taught me that we can make it happen. That's why we're expanding." Robert handed James the folder. 3 more community clinics in different neighborhoods. We want you to oversee them all as medical director." James read through the proposal. "This would help so many more families. You'll need to hire more doctors, train them in our community care model," Robert explained. "Maria has already agreed to be the head nurse coordinator." A child's laughter made them look up. Sophie Garcia was showing her mother her sticker from the dental screening. "Remember when you missed that job interview to help me?" Robert asked. "You chose kindness over career advancement. Now you have both." James watched his team working with patients, remembered the bills on his kitchen table a year ago. Thought of all the lives changed since then. "I'll do it," James said. "But I want to keep treating patients too. No matter my title, I'm still a community doctor first." Robert stood, extending his hand. That's exactly why you're perfect for this role. You never forgot what matters most: caring for people. The park filled with more families as the morning continued. James saw hope in their faces. The same hope he had found on a cloudy day when he chose to help a stranger. Loved this story? Tap that like button and subscribe to Mystic Tales for more. Let us know how this story made you feel with a single word in the comments.